Via Skype, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, president and founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Dr. Jasser, for purposes of full disclosure, we will let folks know that you also happen to hold an important role in my life. You're my personal physician. So now that we've got all the disclosures in place, Zuhdi, as you take a look at the turmoil in Iraq, what do you believe the future of Iraq looks like? Zuhdi, I'm sorry, can you not hear me?
Now I can.
Good. Zuhdi, we welcome you to the program, and as a guy whose advice I follow as my personal physician, I'm just interested in your take on what is transpiring in Iraq and what you believe, how you believe that's going to play out now with ISIS crossing in from Syria and talk of the establishment of the modern caliphate.
Well, thanks, JD, for having me. And bottom line is what we're seeing in Iraq is just a small percent of the savagery that's happening inside Syria. And ISIS in Iraq is a byproduct of the lack of American policy in Syria. So as a result, it's overflowing. We knew that the Syria conflict was not a civil war. It was a regional conflict. Assad would not be present now if it hadn't been for Iran sending in financing, oil, money, troops, and weapons into Syria. So as a result, it has brought to fruition the Iranian policy, which is to not only annex Syria, but annex Iraq, and ISIS is part of that policy, even though they consider them to be obviously an enemy of Iran. ISIS, if you look at the history, a recent report out of the Free Beacon this week shows that ISIS actually was being protected by Iran for a number of years until recently. So bottom line is it's very complicated, but the lack of a Syria policy has bled over into Iraq and has caused a destabilization of the entire region.
Dr. Jasser, in your opinion, what role should the United States be playing in Iraq right now? Some have spoken about returning troops. Former Vice President Cheney talked about as many as 20,000 American troops. You're a former naval officer. What do you think should be done? Anything militarily on the part of the United States?
Well, I think right now there should be two things. First of all, short term, just as we did in Yemen a couple months ago, where we blew the smithereens out of a gathering of Al-Qaeda, of a few hundred of them. I just can't see that it's that hard to target Al-Qaeda motions or ISIS motions through northern Iraq in caravans as they gobble up American weapons. And unfortunately, we're going to have to target them even if they have our weapons because they're going to be used against our interests. So ultimately, I think through airstrikes, even with drones, or as necessary to stop them before they get to Baghdad. Long term is we need to have a vision in the region. Our president has been disengaged from having any vision in the region, and as a result, it's allowed the worst actors to thrive, and we've seen the loss of any influence in Iraq to Iran, as Maliki has gone into there, has leaned more towards Iran than he has any more towards the West. We're seeing them now try to sort of regroup and try to bring Maliki into a reform-type government. But the other thing that we need to realize is part of the reason ISIS is walking through northern Iraq, JD, is because the bottom line is that we left a lot of the Ba'ath generals in charge of northern Iraq. So even though they're supposedly against Al-Qaeda, they have let them march through because they want to see Maliki down. They thrive in creating chaos and a revolution because they want to take back over the Iraq they lost when Saddam was taken down. And we stopped the de-Baathification as Petraeus's idea was, and I think that was a bad idea. And ultimately, we're seeing that chaos come to fruition. So we need a long-term process of, unfortunately, the policy that would have worked would have been maintaining some type of forces agreement as we have in Korea and Germany and elsewhere. Without us being present there, it'll just degenerate as we've seen within a few years. That's the long-term problem. Short-term is to stop Al-Qaeda with airstrikes.
Zuhdi, as we look at this, and you mentioned the resurrection of the Baathists, the party of Saddam Hussein, but how much of this is enshrouded in Sunni Shia strife and that kind of sectarianism within Islam?
Well, that's a great question about whether, is this simply sectarian between Sunni and Shia? Obviously, that is the what has torn apart the Middle East since the beginning of Islam. At the time the Prophet died, there was this sectarian division, and for long that has been one of the primary conflicts. But I will tell you the overarching ideology that goes beyond Sunni Shia is political Islam or the Islamic State. So just like you have Al-Qaeda for the Sunnis, you have Hezbollah and the Khomeinists of Iran for the Shiites. So the ideology is the same, which is the Islamic State, Sharia, Islamic law, and that's why the allies for the West are not our common enemies, because even though we may have a common enemy against Iran, for example, we don't have common allies because they're Islamists on both sides. So left to their own devices as sort of the policy which I've called the Darwin policy, it will devolve into sectarian fights, no different than two large mafia families fighting in the same neighborhood, but they're still both evil. So ultimately, the Sunni and Shia Islamists are evil, and we need to have a president, as Ronald Reagan defined the Soviet Union as being the evil empire. We need a president who has the courage to identify Islamism as the evil ideology that needs to be defeated as the overarching ideology. And we saw in Egypt, there were millions that came to the street to defeat the Islamists of the Brotherhood, and ultimately now we saw the comeback to power of the Egyptian military. Yes, that's more stable, but the majority of Egyptians want neither of those two choices. And unfortunately, most of the Middle East has been torn between two choices of bad and worse. And there is a third pathway for each of these countries, separate from the sectarianism and separate from this battle between Islamism and fascism.
Let me bring in another nation, Zuhdi, Jordan. What do you believe the future holds for the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan?
I think Jordan actually is very much at risk right now. We see the biggest destabilizing factor for Jordan is the number of Syrian refugees that have influxed into that country. You see a large destabilizing factor for Jordan from the Palestinian community there that's extremely anti-Western and anti-Israeli. And ultimately now, as ISIS spreads, part of the ISIS, their name is Islamic State in Sham, which is the Levant that extends from Syria to Iraq and includes their aspirations for a caliphate in Jordan. So ultimately, Jordan, I think, is asking itself is who really are its allies? And if we're going to see a transition generationally in the Middle East, the short term, again, is to maintain our allies, and the Hashemite kingdom is one of our allies. Now, have they moved for reform towards liberty? Absolutely not. No different than the Saudis have not and the other Gulf monarchs have not. But now is not the time to abandon them if we want to see a smooth transition rather than a very violent one, which is what ISIS is trying to do and destabilizing. And Jordan is high on their list of acquiring once they're done with Iraq.
Zuhdi, about a minute left. Define the difference between Islam and Islamism.
Well, I think this is the most important question, JD, of the 21st century, no different than communism was the largest conflict of the Cold War in the 20th century. Islamism is the global aspirations of those who seek to advance a theopolitical ideology that the state should be governed by a constitution, which is the Quran, and the clerics and clergy should be able to control law by Sharia or Islamic law. Islam is the personal faith of Islam that all Muslims, 1.3 billion in the world, a quarter of the world's population, practice in their personal relationship with God. And ultimately, the security of the world depends on Muslims separating the personal practice of Islam from the political threat of global Islamism.
Zuhdi Jasser, the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim's Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith, also the founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. We thank you for your time, and America's Forum is coming right back.